everybody. My name is Richard Evans. I'm a database security product manager here at Oracle. And welcome to July's Ask Tom Database Security Office Hours. Today, we're going to go back to the basics again, and we're going to talk about database roles. Just a reminder, this call is being recorded. The recording will be available on the asktom.oracle.com website, end of the week, early next week or so. You can either go to asktom.oracle.com or you can follow this bit.ly link, bit.ly/asktomdbsec. So I'll post that in the chat as well. Before we get started here, if you haven't joined us, thanks for joining us. This is our monthly database security office hours call. So this is a direct channel into Oracle database security product development. Each session, we hold this on the second Wednesday of the month, and we have an announcement section, we have a technical topic, and we have a Q&A session at the end, okay? So if you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and then we will get to those at the end of the presentation. If you're not comfortable asking questions on this forum, then you can go ahead and paste them, email them to me at richard.c.evans@oracle.com, and we can chat offline, okay? All right, so again, paste those questions in the Q&A, or you can email me if you want to take them offline, okay? We don't record the Q&A session. We don't make that public. So those questions will be semi-private to us here on the webinar. All right, let's get started with some announcements. All right, like always, it's about time to patch again, right? So we want to make sure that we get our quarterly patches applied. The next release update comes out on July 19th. So take a look at those. Make sure you're staying up to date on your patches. You can go to oracle.com/security-alerts to take a look at what patches are out there, not just for the database, but enterprise manager, applications, clients, all those things. You need to take a look at patches for those things too. So today's support corner notes all revolve around Oracle database roles. I'll paste a bunch of these into the chat as well. But there's a bunch out there on support.oracle.com. And then there's also some really good documentation in the 21C documentation. That's what I used as a part of this presentation. Most of you are probably on 19C. That's okay. That's our long-term supported release. Just modify the documentation to be your 19C release instead, okay? Blog posts. We've got a blog at blogs.oracle.com/cloud security. And I want to highlight just maybe 5 or so of these latest blog posts that we've got out there. We've got one, 5 reasons to upgrade to AutoVault and Database Firewall 20.7, some autonomous database users authenticating and managed with Azure Active Directory, which is going to be our topic next month. There's a lot of really neat additional features coming at that. Enterprise Business Suite supports unified auditing, and Elke Phelps did 2 blogs on that, actually, parts 1 and part 2. And then Peter Wall and the Key Vault team have Key Vault 21.4 available for you. So he talks about that. So I'll go ahead and paste these links in the chat as well, so you can get access to those blogs. If you can subscribe, take a look at those blogs on a regular basis. We put out a blog on a regular cadence, so you'll see some good updates to that. Another thing we're really excited about is Oracle Live Labs. If you haven't checked out Oracle Live Labs yet, check it out. It's really cool. You can get hands-on with all sorts of really neat products that Oracle offers. The one that we're really excited to announce is this Oracle Database Security Story of a Hack. And so what that's going to do is kind of walk you through what it's like to be an attacker, what it's like to be a defender, and give you some hands-on experience there with preventing, detecting, mitigating, exfiltrating data, things like that. So I shared that link in the chat as well. So that's available at developer.oracle.com/live labs, and I pasted the direct link into the chat. So take a look at the story of a hack. We've got Oracle Cloud World coming up here in October, and it's going to be in Las Vegas. So October 16 through 20, Oracle Cloud World. We've got a lot of security topics that we're going to present on there. If you have a a database security story you'd like to share, please reach out to Russ Lowenthal. Let him know. If your story is selected, you'll receive a complimentary speaker pass to the event. So I'll go ahead and paste the link to Oracle Cloud in the chat, and then also Russ's email address. So if you have an idea, I mean, don't overthink it, right? If you're thinking, oh, we did this neat project, but no, take out the but, right? Like, go ahead, email Russ and say, hey, Russ, hey, we did this with TDE. We did this with Database Vault. We've got this cool masking project that we've been doing, right? Like, no matter how big or how small, go ahead and reach out, right? Like, it's always good to hear what you guys are working on and to create a dialogue between us, okay? So please, yeah, reach out, let Russ know that you've got something cool going on. All right, so let's go ahead and get to the presentation here today. This started out as a presentation where it's like, do I have enough content for an hour of this? And then I realized, oh no, I have too much content. And so I was told, Rich, you need to break this down into 2 presentations. So we're going to call this session 1 of 2 today. We're going to talk about why roles are important, different types of roles, examples, views that you'll use when you're looking at roles, how to grant, how to revoke, how to audit, and then how to identify users, roles, privileges, all those things. So really back to basics type of presentation here. We are going to touch a little bit on some advanced topics like secure application roles, global roles, but we're not going to dive into those until session 2 of this. But here's our agenda today. We always have to kind of start off with, why do I care, right? Like, why are roles important to me? Why are they important to my organization? So if you think about a small organization, 20 databases, 25 database users, the database has 250 plus system privileges. And let's just say you've got 200 objects, right? Views, procedures, tables, maybe a couple schemas. Now, I'm not good at math, but that's a combination, I think. Maybe I want to call it a permutation, but I think a combination means, it's all of those things repeating. That's a lot of privileges, object and system privileges to worry about, right? Now, what if we get toward a medium database or a large database or an extra large database? Like, I'm not exaggerating when I talk about customers having 10,000 databases. There are some of you on this call. I saw you log in. We've got customers who have 14,000 databases with Oracle Database Vault enabled on it, right? So tens of thousands of databases, hundreds of thousands of users, and then trying to manage the roles and privileges associated with each of those. When Bruce, gets promoted from HR analyst, HR manager, are we going to just go assign these random privileges? No, we want them a part of a role, right? When Sandra gets hired in finance as a peer of Jake, it's, hey, Jake has this access. We need to make sure Sandra has this access too. Okay, Jake has these 3 roles. We'll give them to Sandra. We're done, right? But now what about when John, the business analyst, the SQL guy who has access to everything, leaves the organization? How do we know that we've cleaned up all of his access, right? So if we do this in a role-driven methodology, then we're not worrying about 250 plus system privileges, 25,000 plus object privileges with your enterprise business suite, your PeopleSoft, your SAP, your Siebel, those type of things. Okay, so roles are critical to the environment. Again, everybody should use roles: database developers, business analysts, security, auditors, whether external or internal. And then just some basic examples, right? If we've got our Acme company, we create an Acme DBA role instead of using the default DBA role, because 90% of that stuff in that DBA role we don't use, right? Like I don't know what under any table means, but it's granted to DBA. And it's a part of the ISO standard for SQL. So, hey, there it is, right? But I've never used that system privilege. Acme DBA access. We need to do a create session. We don't need to do the set container that comes along with the connect role. So let's just create our own company-based, and we'll talk about how that can be integrated into Active Directory or Oracle Unified Directory here in a little bit. Read-only access, right? We want to grant read, not select, if we don't need to do and select for update on those tables. So let's create an Acme read, HR read role for our HR application. Same thing with update, same thing with administrator, right? We want to create and differentiate these roles based on the responsibility within the organization. All right, that sounds really easy, but how do we get there? First, we have to identify user roles and privileges. Let's use database security assessment tool. Let's use Audit Vault and database firewall. Let's use DataSafe. Let's use whatever you have at your disposal. Let's just use it and get started somewhere, right? Like we don't know where we're going unless we know where we've been. So let's just pick a point and say, hey, here's where we're at today. Let's see if we can incrementally improve this. Using privilege analysis to identify those used and unused privileges. It's fantastic. Revoking direct grants, right? Let's grant these to roles as much as possible. There are exceptions where you do need to have a direct grant privilege, but for the most part, your day-to-day users need them as part of a role instead. And then let's have those roles managed by your directory services, right? Your Oracle Unified Directory, your Active Directory. Let's externalize, let's make those global instead, right? Secure application roles, we're going to talk about those. I've got a really cool example on those. Granting roles to procedures instead of giving the schema privilege. We'll talk about that as a part of our secure application roles. Auditing, we can audit based on that role. Hey, who used that Acme DBA role and what did they do when they had it, right? We want to think roles, not privileges, right? We want to think Jerry needs access to the HR read, not Jerry needs to select this table and he needs to update this one and he needs it. Like, nope, we need to think Jerry needs HR read, right? We've got a new employee. Hey, make Hank look like Jerry. We want those roles to be identical. We want them to grant them the same roles, okay? So we're going to kind of take this in a different order. We're not going to start with identifying. We're going to start with what are roles and everything, and then we'll get to the identifying users, roles, and privileges at the end of the presentation. But let's go back to the basics here on database roles. So Dan Morgan and I have done a couple presentations on top 10 things you can do to secure your sensitive data. And Dan had this slide, he let me use it. And he talked about Oracle's first multi-factor authentication was in Oracle version 7. He took a picture of his book and the page, and he highlighted where we allowed password controlled roles, right? That's still a feature of the database today here 30 years later. I would encourage you to use secure application roles instead, and I think you'll see why. But, right, we've had this capability for a long time, but the use of it, hit or miss, right? Roles are groups or collections of object privileges, right? So your HR tables, your views, your packages, your procedures. System privileges are like your select any table, your create any view, your administer key management, these type of things that apply to the database kind of as a whole, right? That allow you in and out of other schemas with a select any table. Users who create a role automatically have this. And I'll say that this bites me once in a while with Database Vault. I create a realm and then I put a role in it. And then I go to show someone that sys can no longer access the data or my DBA Deborah can no longer access the data. And oh no, they can access the data. And I'm going, oh, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? It's this role that's inherently granted to the user, right? So if you grant it, if you create it as a system or you create it as a DBA user, but you don't want them a part of that, you have to remember to revoke that role, right? And roles don't get deleted when you delete the user. So just because our Jerry left the organization and he created 3 roles, those roles are owned by sys, okay? So it's kind of an interesting kind of dichotomy there of, hey, you're inherently in it, but just because you created it doesn't mean you own it. So just kind of keep an eye on that, okay? In a multi-tenant, you can have roles that are common or local. And remember, we're moving toward multi-tenant everywhere, right? 21C, 23C, it's going to be container and pluggable databases as the default installation or the only installation there. Your roles from the container typically start with a C ##. You can make those available just to the container, or you can share those to all pluggable databases. So the scenario might be, hey, we've got Acme DBA, and we want the container administrators to be able to use that role within all of the pluggable databases, including the newly created pluggable databases as well. So we created the container level. Yeah, on the opposite side, maybe we have an HR database and a finance database, and those roles are separate. And so we don't need to worry about having that as a globally available role, right? That role is specific to the HR database. The other role is specific to the financial pluggable database, okay? All right, we create different roles. We've got just that basic command here, create role, Acme HR read, right? You guys have used this 100 times, the basic thing. When you want to add a password to it, identified by password, right? HR admin, identified by password. And then I was wondering, well, how do I not identify it? Do I have to, I don't want to delete the role, right? Not identified, right? Hey, if I don't want it to be password protected anymore, create role, Acme, identified, not identified, right? Or alter role, Acme, HR admin, not identified by. If I want to create a role using a package and a procedure, I'll show you that later when we get to secure application roles, identified using, right? We create a role externally identified. Maybe we're doing a radius, identified externally, identified globally, right? Our CMU, our Active Directory, our OUD, our centrally managed users, identified globally. We'll see that as we go in the presentation. Now, one of the things that, you know, when we talk about security and we talk about least privilege, we talk about not having the privilege all the time, right? If I don't need it, I shouldn't have it enabled. We've done a fantastic job on operating system with this, right? When you are in Windows, you don't log in as admin. When you're on Linux, you don't log in with root. You do a sudo command, or you run as in Windows. So when CMAC logs in, he has that admin privilege. I mean, does he need it? He doesn't use it on a daily basis, or, he could paste something in there and oops, we didn't mean to do that, right? So what you can do is you can alter the user, CMAC, default role all except for that HR admin role, right? We can take that off of his default roles when he logs in. So all he has is that DBA access at that point. So he's got that create session that we've granted to them. And then if he needs that role, he can do a set role all, and he's back to where he was, where he has the DBA access and he has the HR admin enabled. So simple things like this create a lot of security, right? Like, so if you log in and you accidentally paste a script into production, none of us have ever done that, especially not the presenter, right? And you're like, oh no, what did I do? Hey, it's okay. You're not logged in as if you were root. You're not logged in as if you could modify the schema or any of those things. You've got your roles that you need, and we can revoke that admin. We can grant that admin when necessary, right? Right, super powerful there. What about password protected roles, right? When CMAC logs in, he doesn't see the HR admin role because it's not enabled by default because it's password protected. He can use the DBMS session set role, pass it the role identified by the password, and he can enable it that way. Basically, all that does is set role, and then the same thing we did before, right? It's just kind of a programmatic way to do it with DBMS session. Now he'll see that he's got that session roles there, okay? So now what if we want to update an existing role to require a password? So you'll see that these are two default roles that we have for the user. We've got DBA access, we've got HR update, and their default roles when we look at them. So they will be enabled when CMAC authenticates to the database. When we add the password to it, we now see the DBA role privs view, and that default role is set to no. So we can take a look to see which roles are defaults and which ones aren't. Now, we want to look a little closer, right? Because it could be a non-default role, but not password protected. So we want to throw in that authentication type column in there as well and take a look at that. So now we've got a default role as no. It's not default because it's password protected. We can see the authentication type there. And so then we can just kind of compare, and we can easily flip him back to where that he is no longer using that password, and he can just authenticate, and he's got those two roles set as default, okay? So again, alter role, HR update, not identified, and our HR admin role is now, password is no, default role is yes, okay? I want to touch briefly on external roles. There's an Oracle Radius client out there for LDAP with primary authentication. I'll paste this into the chat as well. And that way you can get your roles or your users identified externally. Okay, again, this is a very advanced topic that we're not going to cover today, but just understand that that capability is there with the Oracle database. Global roles, again, an advanced topic. We're just going to highlight it a little bit because it's super important, super neat to be able to do these type of capabilities. So if we create Acme DBA access, we identify it globally, and then we grant create session to it, right? We want the Active Directory to manage access to these roles, right? So when you authenticate to the database is when you get that capability, right? So you don't enable it or you don't set role like we did in those last commands. When you authenticate to the database, it goes and it verifies and it says, yes, it matches, this user's in this Active Directory group, he can have access to, okay? And I've got a couple more slides later in the presentation on this, but these are the types of roles that you can create within the Oracle database. A few common roles that you'll see. We've already kind of talked about the connect role. So that provides you the create session, set container privileges, resource, right? Create tables, indexes, procedures, triggers, sequences, etc. It doesn't give you the unlimited table space anymore. And again, like design your own. How many of your users are creating triggers, are creating procedures, are creating sequences? If it's an application, that makes sense. But if it's a user who just needs to create tables in their environment or maybe an index, we've overprivileged that user and they're never going to use those privileges. So let's minimize that. So let's create an Acme resource role instead that does not have create procedure, create trigger, create sequence. Okay. DBA, again, it contains just about everything, right? And most of those things we don't use. Acme DBA instead. Create a subset of those privileges that your database administrators can use on a regular basis. And I know you're probably thinking, Rich, how do I know that? Hey, we'll talk about that later with privilege analysis, okay? You can identify what privileges are being used on a regular basis. Select and execute catalog roles, right? Data dictionary views, packages, procedures in the data dictionary. You know, we see this a lot with like maybe an enterprise manager. It's either select any dictionary or select catalog role. So there's some monitoring apps that do need access to these, but your daily users don't need access to these type of things, right? Export and import full database. This is with data pump. So be very careful with these because they do have access to any schema, okay? So this should only be granted to your data pump export user if you're performing data pump exports. And if they're performing a full data pump export or a export of the non-default schema that they're using, right? So if you create a DP admin, data pump admin user, and he's going to export the HR schema, he's going to need this privilege. But if HR is going to export its own schema, it shouldn't need this privilege. So just be very careful who has access to these roles. And then the one that's always fun is public, right? It doesn't show up in your list of granted roles because everybody has it. It's a default role. It's there. You can't drop, you can't revoke it, you can't modify it from the users, but you can grant privileges to it, right? And we've probably all done this. Hey, I'm gonna grant execute on this procedure to everybody because it's easier. I'm gonna grant select on this table because it's easier, right? Everybody has access if you do that, right? Every database user can have access to it. So be very careful when you grant this to public. Database Security Assessment Tool, DBSAT, checks to see what's granted to public, and I've got a screenshot of that later in the presentation. One of the interesting things that, you know, I didn't know, I want to say I forgot, but the reality is I probably didn't know. I knew SysDBA's current schema was sys. I didn't know SysOpera's current schema was public, right? So interesting there, right? That public is a user, public is a role, like there's there's some subtleties under the cover there when it comes to this, but you see all the time, grant X to public, grant this to public, right? Let's minimize that if we can, right? All right. Now you're going to want to check to see whether your session's enabled, right? So in my session for CMAC, I'm using the sys context function, and I'm using the sys sessions role built-in namespace. With that namespace, I can then pass the role to it and it'll tell me whether that's enabled for my session or not. So my first example, resource, CMAC doesn't have resource. CMAC has HR read. We can see that, okay? If we move on, we set role to none, we can now see that that has gone from true to false. So we can see that by using the sys sessions role namespace and querying it, and we can use this programmatically too. Okay, I had more content here, but in part 2, we're going to talk about session is role enabled from DBMS session versus current is role enabled in DBMS session. So there's some nuances there between invoker and definer rights and how things work. So it's like I said, there's more material here than I initially thought when I thought about talking about roles. So many role related views we're going to talk about real quick. I want to highlight DBA roles, session roles, role privs, sys privs, tab privs. There's about a dozen or so that you can look at. These are probably the 5 most common that I use on a regular basis. Like I want to know what roles are in there and then what authentication type. I'm constantly doing a select star from session roles as I was working on this to know what roles were enabled within the session. DBA role privs, sys privs, tab privs all have corresponding user role privs, user sys privs, as well as all. So if you're not a database administrator, if you don't have those dictionary access, you can use all role privs or all sys privs or all tab privs or user tab privs to get that information, right? To identify what roles, system, or object privileges are granted to users or roles. So real handy stuff. I also want to just highlight, since we talked about container versus common versus local, container versus pluggable roles, you can look at that common column on most of these views and get an idea of where that's coming from. Is it a pluggable database role, or did it come from the container database? The one view I want to highlight here, an example, is this DBA call privs. So all column objects grants in the database, okay? All column object grants in the database. So there's 3 types of things we can do here with column level privileges when it comes to grants. We can do column grants on insert, references, and update. References are like allows a user to create a constraint that refers to the table, okay? We can do a grant update on first, last, email, and phone number on HR employees to our HR update role. So if you think about it, your application or your help desk or your DBAs or developers or whoever's doing your break fix, maybe when it comes to updating this information, they're not going to update the employee ID. They're not going to update the salary. They're not going to update the hire date. They're probably not updating the manager. Like there's only a limited amount of columns that you want them to update. So you can grant update on just those limited columns to a role, and then you can verify that by looking at that DBA call privs role. Okay, so a handy capability there that when we were talking about roles, like, oh, yeah, I can limit even further what these capabilities or, what could be done on some of these objects in my application schema. Okay. Granting and revoking roles, always important, right? Create the role, grant it to CMAC. Revoke the role from CMAC. Now, notice that in this example, I've got 2 revokes in there, okay? So you can stack these in here. So I can revoke DBA access and HR read from my user. I can also grant multiple to that user as well. So I can create the role, I can grant it, and I can grant read to HR admin, and then I can grant DBA access and HR admin to my user. Okay, so we can do multiple statements in there as well. We can create a role and we can grant the access there. So again, it's just grant role to user for identified using, identified externally, and identified globally. All those grant statements are the same. All the grant statements across the board are the same. You can grant multiple roles to a single user. You can't do that permutation where you say multiple users in there. I don't think. I tried, didn't seem to work, because I don't think the database is 100% sure that you mean CMAC and R. Evans, and G. Kramer and these guys need that access. So tell me specifically which user or role you mean. Okay. All right. Now let's go with an example. CMAC has HR admin. He logs in. He tries to grant the HR admin to Evil Rich. Admin option not granted for the role, meaning CMAC does not have the ability to pass that role on to another user. He's not an administrator of the role, right? Remember, those roles are owned by the database, they're owned by system. You might inherit them, you might have access to them, but without the admin option, you don't have the ability to pass that along unless you've got certain high-level system privileges, okay? So let's fix it. Grant HR admin to CMAC with admin option. CMAC logs in. Now he can give HR admin to Evil Rich. Success. Okay. Now, what happens if, let's say, CMAC leaves the organization? Right. In that example, we've done grant HR admin to CMAC with admin option. He grants it along to Evil Rich. We revoke it from CMAC because he's left the organization. I try to log in as Evil Rich. I use my syssession roles, cool new namespace that I learned. False, right? We could have cascading revokes there. If that user is revoked, if that privilege is revoked from that user, then we can have that essentially child user, that child grant be revoked as well, okay? So be very careful here when it comes to granting and revoking users or roles with the admin option. Again, I spent a lot of time on this 21C documentation. There's lots of nuances in there. You can't grant privileges to a single partition on a partition table. I guess that makes sense. Can't grant privileges on user public. So can't do that. Can't grant unlimited table space system to roles. Can't grant reference privileges to roles. Remember, reference was being able to create constraints referring to a column. You can't grant a role to itself, so I couldn't grant HR admin to HR admin. You can't grant externally roles to anything. You can't grant this to a global role or global user. You can't do circular grants, right? Like I couldn't grant HR read to update and then turn around and grant it to HR read, right? The system is like, no, man, that doesn't make sense. And, it sounds silly when I say it now, but if you're in a complex environment with, 50,000 objects and all these different things, you may be like, okay, the quickest point from, A to D is right here, it's B, and I can get to B by granting this role to this role. And you're like, oh, no, wait, that's already granted. So it sounds silly out of context, but it can happen. Now you can use the with delegate clause instead of the with admin clause to grant or revoke the role to a program unit in the grantee schema. Again, I wanted to include that advanced topic session 2, right? So come back and see with delegate in session 2. All right, let's enable some roles. We can see what we've got by doing session roles. We can do set role none. We can do set role all. We can do set role read, HR read. We can do set role except Acme HR admin. We can do DBMS set role. So we can do it programmatically there as well. So you've got lots of options when it comes to how you set those roles, right? I want all my roles enabled except for the admin because I'm not going to be doing any create tables today. When you enable a role individually, only that role is enabled, right? So if I do a set role HR read, the other roles DB access, HR update are disabled, and only the HR read role is enabled. If you need to get around this, you can do set role HR admin, and it can even accept the password for those password protected roles, comma, Acme DBA access. So now I've got both the HR admin role and the DBA access role enabled. One of the things we would probably recommend is, one of the things I would say is, if you need the read access and you need the DB access still enabled, then grant those to the HR admin role. So that way, when you enable that secure application role or that non-default role or that password protected role, those continue to be enabled with it. Okay, but you can do set role HR admin, comma, DB access, comma, HR read. Okay. All right, some restrictions on these roles. You can only have 148 user-defined roles in a session. I know. But Russ and I were talking, he had a customer that actually hit this limit, right? You want to get granular with a lot of this, right? Like you want to get as granular as you can. There's maybe too granular sometimes, right? So you probably won't ever hit that role. Just know there is a role limit. You can't just automatically enable password or secure roles. Again, definers versus invoker privileges. I had 7 slides on this, too much material. Set role all succeeds only if there are no definers rights units in the call stack. You'll get an error if you try to do that and there's anything there. Set role all except. Now remember, when you say except, you can't mean, well, update has read role granted to it. So I want the update role, but I don't want this other role that's granted to it. It doesn't get into those nested roles. It just knows you're granted it. You tell me accept. I accept that one and anything associated with it. So you can't get into kind of this nested granular location. And here's kind of an example. HR read was granted to HR admin. HR admin was granted to CMAC. CMAC logs in, wants all roles except HR read. He's got it anyway because he got it through the HR admin role, right? It wasn't directly granted to him, so it's going to be enabled. Does that make sense? Again, a nuance that you probably never hit, but sometimes where you're like, well, I don't want this role. Oh, this role is probably granted to a role somewhere. So then you need to go look at your role privs. You need to go look at some of those database views, okay? Let's get to some of the fun, secure application role stuff, okay? I really enjoyed this section here. This was a lot of fun, okay? So with our create role statement using the identified using clause, we're gonna create a secure application role. First thing we're gonna do is create a procedure, our HR admin role check. This HR admin role check procedure is just gonna look at the date to see if you're between 8 and 5 p.m. database time. If you are, then you're going to set the role for HR admin. So maybe we have a requirement that our workers only do this work between 8 and 5. Okay. We're going to create that role identified using this procedure. We're going to grant some select, insert, update, delete on our HR employees to the role. And then we're going to grant execute on that to our user. Okay. So we've got our role, we've got our procedure, we've got our grants, we've got our grant execute to the user. Now, when CMAC logs in, CMAC checks the time. He sees the time is 1400. That's between 8 and 1700. He can execute the HR admin role check, and now he has that role. Like really cool stuff, right? Like better than a password, right? Like think about the things you could do with this. Must be coming from a certain IP. Must have a second person logged in, must be using a second client, must pass maybe the ticket ID, right? Like maybe we do HR admin role check out and we add the like ticketed number to it, and we check it that way. I had to make a note of that because I want to do that for the next one. All right, now let's go back and let's say, Rich, but I want my admins to work outside of business hours. And how do I know whether it worked or not? It just says PL SQL procedure successfully completed. Okay. throw the word not in there, not between, add an else, raise an exception. Now we've got a custom exception here that's going to say retry outside business hours. Okay, let's run it again. CMAC logs in. Again, it's 1400. He runs the HR admin role check. He gets retry outside business hours. Super cool, right? Super cool, right? We've got this procedure. We can do a lot of neat things here with it, right? And then you want to know what type of application roles you have. Let's take a look at the view. We ran it, we get an error. We can take a look at the DBA application roles view, and we can see that this role is HR admin. It's associated with the HR admin role check package procedure that is in the HR, or the SEC manager, the security manager schema. So again, one of those views that you've probably seen when you've been scrolling through views and you're like, application roles, what do I do with that? Now you know, right? Now you can create these secure application roles. Centrally managed users. Again, an advanced topic, but we're going to touch on it because it's really important. And we've got a presentation from last year that Alan Williams did on Ask Tom on essentially managed users. And Russ, I don't know if you can find the link to that and share it, but that'd be great. But yeah, Alan Williams has done a presentation on this, and heck, Russ might have done a presentation on centrally managed users as well, because it's really powerful, right? The idea is on the left-hand side, we've been working with our database roles, system privileges, and object privileges, right? We want to create a global role, and we want to map that to the Active Directory groups on the right-hand side. So we're going to create that role, Acme DB Access, identified globally as, and we're going to pass it the CN, the OU, and the DCs, right? So we're going to pass it the map to the group that is in Active Directory or Active Directory. Enterprise User Security does Oracle Internet Directory, Oracle Unified Directory. Centrally managed users is specific to Active Directory. Okay, we've got two different tools to do this. Right now, we're talking about centrally managed users and Active Directory. Okay, so this is important because we can map these connect statements or these create session system privileges to a role in Active Directory. So when Jerry, the SQL guy, leaves the organization, we revoke him from Active Directory. His access no longer has create session on any of the databases out there, right? Really powerful stuff, really powerful stuff. Okay, let's just do a quick kind of how it maps, because it does involve create statements. Initially, CMAC logs in, attempts to, he lacks that create session privilege. We create an Active Directory group, Aura DB Access, or Acme DB Access, or HR DB Access. We grant DBA role based on the distinguished name. So this is our create role within the Oracle database, identified globally. We grant create session to that newly created role. We add CMAC to the Active Directory group that corresponds to that role. Now, when he authenticates, he's successful and he sees that he has that session role. Okay, so again, really powerful stuff to get away from managing 10,000 databases and 100,000 users and 250 system privileges and however many object privileges to, hey, we take care of a lot of this through our Microsoft Active Directory. Okay. All right, if we've got roles and we've got access to data, we need to audit, right? So we can create the role. Again, in this example, we create a common role, right? A role that's available to the container database as well as the pluggable database. We create an audit policy that is also a common audit policy. And we're going to audit based on the use of that Acme DBA role, right? This makes a lot of sense. Hey, what are my DBAs doing? I don't know. Okay, how about we create a role, we grant the privileges to that role, and then we create an audit policy, and we audit that role, right? So when you create a new pluggable database, they automatically have access to that new pluggable database, and then they're automatically being audited by our unified audit policy. Powerful stuff. Same thing with a pluggable database. You can do the same thing. You can just do it on a local level, right? On the pluggable level, create the role, audit the role, enable the audit on the role, right? Real powerful stuff that we can do here. And so the unified auditing has that ability to do role auditing. All right, this is that section that was first, right? Where we talked about, hey, we got to know where we're at to know where we're going. So what we're going to do now is, now that we understand roles, we understand the different types of roles, we know how to go create roles, we know how to view the views associated with the roles, we know how to create a secure application role, we know all that stuff. But how do I get started, right? And the first thing I would suggest is to use privilege analysis. Privilege analysis is a part of your Enterprise Edition license. So if you've got Enterprise Edition database, you've got privilege analysis. You can create a capture on a particular role. So like, let's say in this example, we want to look at our Acme HR update role to see whether all of the grants to that role are being utilized. Okay, so we're going to create our capture. We're going to specify a role list, which could contain multiple roles. We're going to enable our capture, and then we're going to go on vacation. Where do we want to go? Hawaii, Alaska. I'm in Texas. I'd rather go to Alaska right now. And then after that, we're going to disable the role of the capture and then generate the report. Okay, so I can't tell you whether or not the role needs the privileges. I can tell you what privileges were used versus privileges unused. Okay, so if you run this for a week, if you run this for a month, it just runs in the background and just essentially creates a checkbox that says this object was used by this role, this privilege was used. The generation of the report is where it kind of correlates that. What does he have? What did he use? All those things, right? The work comes from the generate, not from just sitting there in the background, checkboxing these type of things, right? But so on the left-hand side, we can see that our Acme update and our Acme read roles used these object privileges on these particular objects. On the right-hand side, we can see that our HR update didn't do delete on departments or insert or update or even select on departments. Maybe it would do select over the course of time, but there were things that it didn't do. So maybe I could evaluate, does the update role ever delete a department? I don't think so. That doesn't sound like something we do. We might update the department name, but we wouldn't delete a department. So we could revoke a role, right? We could revoke a privilege there from the role. So very capable. Combine that with scheduler and auditing, you can do all sorts of neat things, man. You could run these PAs, these privilege analysis assessments on a weekly basis, quarterly, ad hoc, during sprints. You can identify trends. There's a lot of things that you can do there that, you know, you probably aren't doing today that are really powerful to help you identify what's going on within your database. Another tool is the DB security assessment tool. DBSAT gets better all the time. I really enjoy talking to Pedro, and every time I look at this, it's just got so many neat things. So we can see user accounts, privileges and roles, authorization controls. We can see security features utilized, so password authentication, global, external, roles and privileges. And then we can get into, 13 out of 69 users have been directly or indirectly granted database management privileges. And here's what they are, right? We can see users with that DBA role. Hey, DBA Deborah, Harvey, and Nicole, we're going to move you to Acme DBA because it's a subset. We can see what privileges were granted to public. Remember, I talked about that. Granting it to public gives it to everybody. DBSAT will tell you that, hey, there's no grants to public, okay? You can see whether roles were granted to public. We can see users with powerful roles, okay? So, hey, 12 out of 69 users have been directly or indirectly granted powerful roles, right? So we can see that export full database type of role there too. Like, ooh, let's maybe backup admin needs it, but maybe DBA Deborah doesn't. Same kind of thing with database firewall, Audit Vault and database firewall. We can identify by auditing who was granted DBA access, so I can see those in my all activity reports. I can do user entitlement snapshots as well, so I can look at the latest. I can mark one as maybe a post upgrade, and then I could create to see what role privileges changed between post upgrade and today, right? So you can do a lot of this capability with Audit Vault and database firewall, so we can understand what our users have, what they're using, what they're not using. We combine that with privilege analysis, and then we can start to build out our roles, right? Like that perfection, that nirvana of getting to role usage and getting to a directory service. DataSafe. DataSafe is our cloud and on-prem solution. If you've got databases, autonomous, DBCS in OCI, you've got access to Oracle DataSafe, right? So with DataSafe, you can monitor your on-prem and your cloud databases, but DataSafe kind of takes the capabilities of DBSat and applies it to your fleet of databases. So we could get a list of database security going on across our 10,000 databases. We can understand maybe drifting from that baseline, actionable reports based on STIG, user roles and privileges type of thing. We can look at overprivileged users and we can see, hey, some of these users have database vault administrator. Do they need it? I mean, that's for you guys to decide, right? We can see when last passwords were changed, what user roles are most prevalent. So DataSafe gives you that capability at the cloud level, but then you can also choose to monitor those on-premises databases as well. So again, you've got to know where you're at to know where you're going. And so that's what we'd advise you to do, right? Like get started with these identifying users, roles, and privileges with Database Security Assessment Tool, DBSat, Audit Vault and Database Firewall if you have a license for it, or DataSafe if you're in the cloud or if you've licensed it for your on-premises databases. You can use Oracle Privilege Analysis today in your Enterprise Edition license for those used and unused privileges and roles, so you can get an idea and start to narrow down the scope of what is actually being used within your database. You want to revoke those direct grants on system and object privileges where you can. Start to give those to those roles. So if you're running privilege analysis and you see that users are using these privileges, but they're directly granted, okay, let's grant it to a role. Let's revoke the direct if we can, and then let's start to migrate them that way, right? You want to enable granted roles only when necessary, right? The non-default roles again, right? Like we don't use root, we don't use administrator for everything. We do a sudo command or we do a run as, or we can use secure application roles where they can only be enabled when we meet the criteria. We can grant a role to a PL/SQL procedure instead of giving the schema those privileges. So that way we can understand that, oh, this procedure runs it, right? And it's got those capabilities. And then again, we want to audit that activity. We want to understand what's going on with these highly privileged roles. We want to understand what users are doing with that Acme DBA role, whether it's in the container or those pluggable databases, okay? Lots of neat things that we can do with roles that I thought was going to be like a 20, 30-minute presentation is now turning into a two-parter, right? So, all right. Thanks, everybody. The next Ask Tom Database Security Office Hours is going to be on Wednesday, August 10th. And we're going to have Alan Williams back on covering Oracle Identity Access Management and the improvements that they've made with integrating with Azure Active Directory and databases. And I mean, it's changing so quickly, I can't keep track of what it is. But his team is doing a phenomenal job with this. And so we're going to have him back on in August to talk about that.